ferocity of her appetites, because she began to feast upon him the moment the door of the limo was closed, before the chauffeur had time to raise the partition that gave the passengers their privacy. Afterwards, he, the chauffeur, spoke with reverence of her naked body. While the newspaper men plied him with tequila, he whispered about her swarming and predatory nudity as if it were a miracle. Who'd have thought she was way the wrong side of 40? I guess somebody upstairs wanted to keep her just the way she was. I would have done anything for such a woman, the chauffeur moaned. I would have driven at 200 kilometers per hour for her if it was speed she wanted. I would have crashed into a concrete wall for her if it had been her desire to die. Only when she lurched into the 11th floor corridor of the hotel, half-dressed and confused, stumbling over the unclaimed newspapers whose headlines about French nuclear tests in the Pacific and political unrest in the southern province of Chiapas smudged the bare soles of her feet with their shrieking ink, only then did she understand that the suite of rooms she had abandoned was her own. She had slammed the door and didn't have the key, and it was lucky for her in that moment of vulnerability that the person she bumped into was me, Mr. Umeed Merchant, photographer, a.k.a. Rye. Her so-to-speak chum, ever since the old days in Bombay, and the only shutterbug within 1,001 miles who would not dream of photographing her in such delicious and scandalous disarray, her whole self momentarily out of focus, and worst of all, looking her age, the only image stealer who would never have stolen from her that frayed and hunted look, that bleary and unarguably bag-eyed helplessness, her tangled fountain of wiry, dyed red hair quivering above her head in a woodpeckerish topknot, her lovely mouth trembling and uncertain, with the tiny fjords of the pitiless years deepening at the edges of her lips, the very archetype of the wild rock goddess halfway down the road to desolation and ruin. She had decided to become a redhead for this tour because at the age of 44 she was making a new start, a solo career without him. For the first time in years she was on the road without Ormus. So it wasn't really surprising that she was disoriented and off balance most of the time. And lonely. It has to be admitted. Public life or private life makes no difference, that's the truth. When she wasn't with him, it didn't matter who she was with. She was always alone. Disorientation, loss of the East, and of Ormus Cama, her son. And it wasn't just dumb luck, her bumping into me. I was always there for her. Always looking out for her, always waiting for her call. If she'd wanted it, there could have been dozens of us, hundreds, thousands, but I believe there was only me. And the last time she called for help, I couldn't give it, and she died. She ended in the middle of the story of her life. She was an unfinished song abandoned at the bridge, deprived of the right to follow her life's verses to their final, fulfilling rhyme. 2 hours after I rescued her from the unfathomable chasm of her hotel corridor, a helicopter flew us to Tequila, where Don Angel Cruz, the owner of one of the largest plantations of blue agave cactus and of the celebrated Angel distillery, a gentleman fabled for the sweet amplitude of his counter-tenor voice, the great rotunda of his belly and the lavishness of his hospitality, was scheduled to hold a banquet in her honor. Meanwhile, Vina's playboy lover had been taken to hospital in the grip of drug-induced seizures so extreme that they eventually proved fatal. And for days afterwards, because of what happened to Vina, the world was treated to detailed analyses of the contents of the dead man's bloodstream, his stomach, his intestines, his scrotum, his eye sockets, his appendix, his hair, in fact, everything except his brain, which was not thought to contain anything of interest, and had been so thoroughly scrambled by narcotics that nobody could understand his last words, spoken during his final comatose delirium. Some days later, however, when the information had found its way onto the internet, a fantasy fiction wonk hailing from the Castro district of San Francisco and nicknamed elrond@rivendell.com explained that Raoul Paramo had been speaking Orcish, the infernal speech devised for the servants of the Dark Lord Sauron by the writer Tolkien. Ashnazg durbatuluk, Ashnazg gimbatul, Ashnazg thrakatuluk, Ach borzum ishi krimpatul.